last time.
Hi, everybody. If there isn't everybody, welcome to Liberty.me Live. I'm Lucy Steigerwald. I'm here with the Sheldon Richman. He deserves a the. After much technical difficulties, we both appear to be here, and that's good. And you know Sheldon Richman from Center for a Stateless Society and the Freeman in the past and the Freedom Daily, and weekly he's on Reason, and his blog is Free Association, and so is this little podcast we've got going. And what are we talking about today, Sheldon? I should say let's get down to business.
We are talking about an op-ed that I wrote called King John Would Envy Barack Obama, President Obama. And
well,
so
and
go ahead.
Why? Just why? Explain yourself.
I guess I could be accused of some slight exaggeration, and that may be. But I was trying to. I was doing another column in observing the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta. If people were here 2 weeks ago, they'd remember we actually talked about that. And so it occurred to me that with Obama conducting drone wars in I don't know how many countries, more or less regular war in Iraq and Syria, that without any congressional authorization, that he seems more at liberty to do what he wants and do bad stuff than King John was when the barons forced Magna Carta on him. At least, even though King John ignored Magna Carta pretty much and it was nullified by the Pope and all that, we won't go into those details again. At least he had he probably at night didn't sleep that well, knowing there were rebellious barons who would withhold money and give him grief. What keeps up Barack Obama at night? Does he think there's going to be a tax strike? Does he even think there's going to be people in the streets protesting? No. He doesn't have to worry about any of that. So that was the hook for this piece to discuss all the stuff that Obama is doing without any kind of authorization. He doesn't believe he needs it, and this should be intolerable to people.
And it isn't. There's kind of a million avenues we could take from just this, even just the headline, but also in the body of the piece you kind of talk about basically war powers, and I don't know if you want to go, be specific this evening about that as well. And I mean, I don't know. Again, there are a million angles. Like as anarchists, we don't think a constitutionally solid war is necessarily a good one, but they're just sort of practical roadblocks to make Congress actually vote on it. If the president just says, "I'll go to war," but it doesn't count as war, and you won't bother to vote on it.
Right.
I'm trying to think of a way, just what to ask about this. I mean, I get so cynical about this. Did anyone ever, obey the War Powers Act before or since 73? I mean,
no president has wanted to invoke it since it was passed because they didn't want to acknowledge that there was that limit on the president's ability to make war. So. And Obama went to war in Libya. He bombed Libya in an effort to change the regime, which happened in 2011. And he said, well, these aren't really hostilities, so the War Powers Act is not relevant. And some people laughed at that, but not enough people laughed at it. He should have been laughed out of town.
Right.
And yet he said that with a straight face, that this didn't qualify. And there were members of Congress who agree with him. Now, there were some that don't. Like Rand Paul and others. Rand Paul, I don't think, was in the Senate in those days, but there were people who said you should at least have to come and get a declaration, or you need to at least invoke the War Powers Act, which lets the president. I mean, this is all real bogus when you think about it. It lets the president, without authorization, place troops in a combat situation, in hostilities. But that is only supposed to be when there's some threat to the United States, which there wasn't, obviously, in Libya. So number one, he should have been able to do that. But even if he did it, he's supposed to get authorization within 30 days, and if he doesn't get authorization from Congress, he's supposed to withdraw them, I think, in 60 days. and then there's some 90-day deadline too. There's a whole bunch of deadlines. Well, all that was just ignored, and not enough, people in Congress with any clout were pushing it. They just let him get away with it. Now he's doing similar things in Syria and Iraq with respect to the Islamic State. And he did ask for an authorization, but he said, I don't need it. I'll ask for it just to have, cheerleaders. But then what he asked was so vague and broad that people who identify the Democrats were saying this is just this is a precedent for unlimited global war. So it's ridiculous. So some Democrats in Congress were very reluctant to go with it because it was so broad. But and the funny thing is, Republicans didn't want to go with it. They thought it wasn't specific. It didn't have there wasn't enough of a plan behind it. So it got nowhere. But that didn't stop Obama from prosecuting these wars. And then he's also supporting Saudi Arabia's war, carpet bombing in Yemen. Although we've been, of course, the U.S. has been bombing with drones, has been hitting Yemenis with Hellfire missiles for a long time. Anyway, that goes back to the Bush days. So it's a mess. So he has less to worry about than King John did. It seems to me he can do whatever he wants.
Well, I mean, the Iraqi and Afghanistan authorizations for use of military force, those are the technicalities. You always need, some stretching of language or some excuse. And well, he's not. I mean, I quite easily believe that in his own mind, when he sleeps at night, he does not think that he is stretching, the laws and the authorizations to the point of absurdity, because conveniently enough, some terrorist maybe, met another terrorist who shared a terrorist meeting with someone from Al-Qaeda, so darn it, the AUMF applies. I mean, it almost feels like any restrictions on war are fruitless, because if they want a war, they're going to have one.
You're more charitable.
Which isn't something Obama invented.
You're being more charitable than
am I more?
Than I'm in a mood to be. It's true. He hasn't. One of the complaints made, and I quoted this in my own article, and I forget who actually made it. Well, I don't think it was Glenn Greenwald, but somebody like that was saying that he's not publicly or even given to Congress or even to the special privileged members of Congress that get to see this stuff when nobody else does, a detailed document spelling out the reason the president is allowed to do this legally. Normally, I say normally, it happened a lot in the Bush administration. In this respect, the Bush administration was actually better than Obama. Their Office of Legal Counsel actually would come up with a document. It might have been full of crap, but at least they came up with a document. All Obama's done is given, I think, a couple of pages of talking points to those special members of Congress, which I guess word of which have been leaked. I don't know if the actual document's been leaked. Maybe it has. I think there's a link in my piece to it. But it hasn't been released to the public. At first, Obama said, and his people said, well, this is just inherent in the powers of the presidency, as commander-in-chief. And Bush used to pull that too, right? It was called the unitary executive doctrine. This is just inherent in the executive power. Then they backed away from that when they took a little flack, and so they started invoking the 2001 and 2002 AUMFs, the authorization for the use of military force, the first one being for Afghanistan, second one being for Iraq. But that has been bashed. If you go to any war or search around at Counterpunch or Consortium News, you'll find articles showing that is so thin. First of all, look, the 2001 authorization for the use of military force against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda specified Al-Qaeda and associated organizations that had, were related to 9/11. He can't use the 2001. The Islamic State broke with Al-Qaeda some years ago, and had nothing to do with 9/11. To stretch, that's really a stretch. On Iraq, it seems even less so. That was about Saddam Hussein and alleged WMD. He wasn't tied in with Al-Qaeda, no matter how much they wanted us to believe that. He had nothing to do with 9/11. So this is not being accepted by people who understand these things legally. It's extremely thin. I mean, even to call it thin is to overstate it, because that makes it sound like there's something there, but there's nothing there at all. It's so thin, it's as thin as this non-existent tissue I'm holding. You can see perfectly well through it. It's outrageous. And, as Bill Bennett once asked, where's the outrage?
Right. And I think that even if I do sort of think if they want a war, they do get one 99% of the time. But you want to make them beg for it. You want them to have to go through the process and to pretend that, we have a say in it at all. And that's how bad it is. That's how sort of arrogant they are, is that, and Obama's that way on other issues, domestic ones as well. This really vile attitude of, I will do this, and my God, aren't I magnanimous to be asking Congress to give me permission so I don't have to make it an executive order or some other unilateral decision. It's very unsettling.
Yep. In 2012, remember when we almost bombed Syria, the U.S. government almost bombed Syria, he clearly was reluctant to do that, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff apparently didn't want to do it either. So he threw it to Congress, I think, as a way to have an obstacle. He placed an obstacle in his own way, because I don't think his heart was in that. But even when he did that, he said, I don't need an authorization. So they always say that, and I think his advisors are always telling him, and also, just those grayheads around Washington who want to preserve, no matter what party's in, they want to preserve the power of the presidency. These people that sometimes we don't even know their names because they're so inside. But they were probably telling him, even if you're going to take it to Congress, you must say you don't need to take it to Congress. Think of future presidents. You must think of the future. You must think of this institution. So you have to utter the words, I'm sending this to Congress, but I don't need to. I think that's what goes on behind the scenes. I really do.
I don't think you're wrong about that. I initially, as much as I hated, Bush and Cheney while it was happening, I was a teenage libertarian. I was riled up, still am. I was never quite as into, and also because I'm overly nice. I don't necessarily want to bring out the gallows for Dick Cheney or somebody. So I never quite was with often liberals who were like, we need to actually punish these people, and I certainly kind of feel that way now. But what really changed my mind on that was Greenwald's maybe 2 books ago, Liberty and Justice for Some, it might be called. Yeah. But he talks about Ford pardoning Nixon, which is sort of in that awkward spot after most of my history books, but before I was actually paying attention, and just that he's talked about the Nixon administration exactly the same way as Obama talked about the Bush administration. You acknowledge the mistakes, but because something, America must move forward, and there's just this complete lack of disincentive to do this again, because even if they're not as vile of a president, Nixon was pretty bad. I don't know much about Ford specifically. Even if they're not as bad, nobody wants to tie their own hands. No president will ever want to tie their own hands. If they want to weasel, maybe do that half as badly as their predecessor, but you can never tie your hands because you might need to do it sometime. That is just functionally how it works. That's actually how it works over there in D.C.
Right, because they all buy the indispensable nation premise, which is really an imperial premise that the U.S. needs to be able to do anything, anywhere, to shore up, to defend its credibility, which was the old Kissinger defense. You had to get involved anywhere it appeared, where something was going on, because if you didn't, even if it wasn't objectively important, subjectively, America's credibility was always at stake. So you had to just preserve the credibility, even though it may have had, no bearing on the fate of the American people, their well-being, their economic well-being, or whatever. And then I think they believe that. Kissinger articulated it, but I think they all believe that.
That's such a limited idea of credibility. I mean, even when I put on, again, sort of a minarchist hat, I think of credibility in terms of America has these lovely sounding ideals that it repeatedly fails to uphold. And I always think about it as conservatives, neocons, any warmonger, they profess to love America and they want to let it do whatever it wants. I mean, that's, letting an indulgent child throw a tantrum, like a deadly tantrum, whereas I would like that child to have a little discipline and not do whatever it wants, which to me, in my mind, even as an anarchist, that means I love America more, because I possess the capacity to be disappointed when it bombs the shit out of various places. which maybe I shouldn't, expect anything from America, but I just
Yeah, but
getting a bit weird.
you're lacking the imperial premise, namely that we are the glue that holds the world together. And
Yeah.
if it wasn't for that glue, the world would just fly apart. Is that what's the centripetal or centrifugal? Which is the goes out? Whatever one. Everybody Google that.
Yes, do Google that.
It's the one where
like another
tear apart, not go together.
Another positive about America is supposed to be, the nice balance of power thing. The lack of an imperial president. Have you read Gene Healy's book, The Cult of the Presidency? Ever? I might have asked you this once before.
But I read articles by Gene, and he does great work on this, like others, as other issues.
Yeah, and he's been doing some good anti-war stuff lately. Actually, I think he's only kind of getting better and better. I really didn't have a good sense of how deliberately anti sort of king, how initially the idea that the president was anything like a king was something to really be avoided. Obviously, there were a million other problems with early America, hypocrisies and stuff. But sort of, the pomp and circumstance, and the White House is just covered in barbed wire, and if you belong, you're going to federal prison for a decade. I mean, just the avoidance of that sort of attitude, the lingering memory that this was not supposed to be a king, and not literally be a king still, but there's the aversion to that attitude is long ago lost, and that is very unfortunate.
Yeah, I read a book recently about John Quincy Adams. He's a very key person in the building of the American Empire. Beginning with the whole continent, and when he was Secretary of State, actually under James Monroe, before he was president, and he, among some of those people, really one thing he hated about the Constitution was that the war power was given to the Congress. He thought that was wrong. He thought that was clearly an executive power. This is the famous John Quincy Adams, of course, who gave the speech about America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. So, which is something we could do a webinar about someday. Put that speech into context. I think libertarians overquote that and read too much into it. Keep in mind that again, he lamented the fact that the war power was given to the Congress, and wished it were otherwise. And of course, he and Monroe were accused of going to war without congressional authorization when they let Andrew Jackson go into Florida before it belonged to the United States government, and kill Spaniards and Indians and seize the territory. There were people that wanted Old Hickory's head for that, and also, but Monroe and Madison defended him. So anyway, you're right, it's an old struggle.
Yeah, I mean, I don't ever want to. Actually, at my I'm not going to name names, but at my first fee conference, I even for my tastes back then, I detected a little too much of everything was just so darn free in the 18th century in America, and I think that attitude. I think it's very, very, very important to realize that the guys who did write the really lovely, poetic language of liberty stuff were absolutely horrible when they were given even 18th century presidential powers, I mean, if the guys who were obviously insightful enough to bring these ideas to the forefront of the whole country were that bad in charge, then, obviously our people are going to be much worse, the way that I think that if we tried to write a constitution today, the end result might not be that different, but the language of it would be worse. It would be this thick and full of positive liberties.
Well, Jefferson, to pick, one of the people that libertarians think was among the best of them, however weak he might have been in relative terms, because he owned slaves, but leave that aside. He knew he had no. He knew. I mean, when you get into constitutional interpretation, I think there's a lot of vagueness, but he knew the prevailing opinion was that there was no constitutional authority for him to buy the Louisiana territory
Right.
from Napoleon. He knew that. He even entertained the idea of a constitutional amendment and then decided not to raise the issue. So he knew that he was doing it. So what happened to all his talk about the Constitution being the chains that bind the national government, in order to protect liberty? When there was something they wanted, it was easy to ignore.
And that's how it's always worked, and I kind of assume it always will work that way if you're talking about a government, because in law as well, it's all about what can I squeeze out of this wording that's not technically directly in violation, but I mean that's literally the name of the game. I remember when I called Justin Amash's office and his communications guy, they were debating some bill that might have been as bad as they thought, or might have been nothing at all, but Amash was, and his people were raising the excellent point that you're trying to weasel us with these words. You're trying to, leave the potentiality for extra powers. I mean, that is government and law, and when you know that, it's very hard to respect even constitutional, or minarchist or all those supposed smaller governments, because that's just not how it works.
Yeah, I'll recommend a paper that you can find online from a very good libertarian legal scholar named John Hasnas, Hasnas. He's got a paper called The Myth of the Rule of Law. Mm-hmm. So you can look that up, and it's really worth it. Everybody should read that. And the point he makes is he's talking about now under legislative law. He's not talking about law in a sort of a common law anarchist setting. He says if you look at today, you can get any result you want, right? If you have a preconceived result, and he gives an example of two people who want to get to an opposite result in a particular case. They can each find their own path through the statute law, through the case law, and get even the Constitution, and get to where they want to go. And he illustrates this, and because there's a lot, there are contradictory opinions, contradictory rulings, and so you can. It's like scripture, right? You can conjure what you want. And so how do we call that the rule of law? Remember, they used to say, we have a rule of law, not men.
Used to. They still said that.
Men meaning people. But if it's people who are doing all this interpretation and deciding subjectively which case law applies, which case law doesn't apply, how can you call that a rule of law? It's not like we feed the problem into a computer which has been programmed with the, quote, proper interpretation of the Constitution and the law, and the statute law, and then it spits out the infallibly correct ruling. There's no such thing. That can't be.
Besides, a man or woman obviously would have programmed said computer anyway, so you still would have the same problem. I mean,
what do we do? Have an election to see who the programmer should be? How do we know that person's interpretation of what's going to go into the program is right? So exactly. You can't get out of this. That's why I've said, and I know some people have taken objection to this, that all constitutions are living constitutions. Mm-hmm. Conservatives like Thomas Sowell like to say, they really bridle at this idea of the and Walter Williams will write about it a lot too, who I believe is a libertarian, not a conservative, but only he's a constitutionalist. Mm-hmm. He has what Jeff Hummel calls a constitutional fetish, and he'll say, I like to keep the Constitution in my pocket because I like to know what the rules are, and I wouldn't want to play poker with someone who believed that the rules were living rules. And I just think that's wrong. The Constitution is always going to be living. There's no way around it because human beings will always be interpreting it. There's new situations that arise, but even old situations. Look, even the Supreme Court has changed its mind about things over the years. We went from Dred Scott or Plessy versus Ferguson to Brown. Other cases have overturned previous cases, rulings. And so what does it mean to say a rule of law? Now, like I said, Hasnas is not talking about an anarchist situation where you have sort of judge-found law, because there you do get something more like a rule of law, because it's not no small group of people can control it or steer it in any way. So that's a separate subject, but I don't want him to. I wanted to make the distinction that he goes to great pains to make. But Yeah, this idea that somehow the law can speak to us or the Constitution can speak to us. No, it's always people speaking.
Well, this comes back to my sort of eternal question. As bad as America turned out, or, the War Powers Act has been ignored, I mean, I can never decide myself, so this isn't even, that I have any great opinion here, is the existence of, the nice-sounding First Amendment or the War Powers Act, is that out there helping at all? People should know they should be following the First Amendment, as subjective to a point as that is. Is it better to have that out there and being mostly ignored, but there's this vague suggestion we're supposed to follow that? Is it doing any good at all to have that out there, or is it just sort of confirming that it's all going to be ignored by these people because they are going to do what they want, they are going to find their way to do what they want? And I don't know, I sort of waffle on that.
Well, I guess that it's there and that they violate it gives us the stuff of teaching object lessons to people. So I guess that's useful. I mean, what would the alternative be? They were doing all this, but there was no written constitution?
Yeah, or some positive liberty sort of actively worse, specific sort of, you have the right to this, and the president can make war every Tuesday if he feels like it, that sort of thing. I mean, it always could be worse, I suppose. I mean, if we had the wherewithal, could use these laws, maybe we'd have more of a chance to say, you violated this, and, there are avenues, and occasionally some semblance of justice squeezes out, but it's usually for some individual, perhaps, who's been jailed or something. I don't think institutional justice can't really get that out of what we have.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one big problem is that and we can understand why it happens this way, but there are never any recriminations.
Right.
Right. And like you were saying, the new administration always looks back, no matter how critical they might have been when they were running for office. They always say it's time to move ahead. No, we don't want recriminations. No, we do want recriminations. I mean, this was the cry after Vietnam finally ended. I mean, when you look at what was done to the Vietnamese people and to the Vietnamese and the land that's called Vietnam. I mean, for so many years, such devastation, such cold-blooded killing, and to say there shouldn't be, the worst you could say was that it was a blunder, right? It was a mistake. You couldn't say it was a crime. If you said that, you would be shut out of polite company, society. Noam Chomsky stopped getting published in the New York Review of Books and other places when he talked about Vietnam as a crime, and the actual people that were responsible for it as criminals, not just people who made a big mistake, and despite their noble intentions, they were foolish. I mean, yeah, if you say that, even today with Iraq, if you say that, people will come down hard and say, no, it was faulty intelligence, or there's been an attempt to rehabilitate Bush and the Iraq War by the
already, yeah.
By the neocons, of course, because they were involved in it. David Brooks has been doing this, but no, it was a crime. They knew what was going to happen. They knew they were going to. First of all, it already happened all through the '90s with Iraq, right? They were killing children. We know about Madeleine Albright on 60 Minutes saying it's worth it. We have to kill 500,000 children for whatever the reason it was worth it. What happened to her? Did anything happen to her? I'll tell you what happened to her.
She's not
Clinton nominated her for Secretary of State. She was only ambassador to the UN in those days. She got a promotion. She got a promotion.
And now she's two of the shows that I've been fond of, Gilmore Girls and Parks and Recreation, have had a stunt casting with Madeleine Albright for like 5 minutes, and it's repulsive that they do that. Or Stephen Colbert, just tearing into Bush to his face at the White House press correspondence dinner, masterful thing in 2005, ends his show doing a cute little skit that involves Henry Kissinger, completely destroying any credibility of his ability to actually point out people who are just vile. But it's okay because Kissinger's old now, and he pops up in contexts like that now, and somehow it's okay. And that's the thing. I don't want to, kill their whole families and string them up in the town square per se, but a modicum of a disincentive, my God. I mean, there's nothing happens to them. they still get invited to the best parties. They get the titles and the security and the money. It's appalling. Like it's enough to make you into a raving lunatic, and they think you're an adolescent leftist in 2005 or something. But it's true, though. I mean, it's true. There's no disincentive for these people.
No, they still get into the New York Times editorial page whenever, op-ed page anytime they want. Anytime Madeleine Albright puts out a book, and she writes frequently, what's his name? Jon Stewart will have her on, and he's so deferential. Suddenly, all the satire goes out the window. He treats her like a combination of grandmother and distinguished elder stateswoman, fawning over her.
Mm-hmm.
How do you explain that? I mean, does he ever say, why did you say it was worth it for to kill 500,000 kids in Iraq?
Ideally, there is some... Now, I don't think that the Christopher Cantwell, LouRockwell.com style of just sort of huddled in your own corner being right is necessarily worthwhile. Maybe it's the journalism instinct. I want to talk to horrible people. At Reason, I once edited a short interview that Jacob Sullum did with the drug czar at the time, Gil Kurlikowski, and I was kind of joking. I was like, "Oh, can I write like I'm an idiot? I'm a terrible person. My job should not exist." But like, Sullum is very good. He's very restrained, but he can throw it down when he needs to. But he had a very, he talked to him without just sort of like calling him a whatever you'd call them, and there's a place to try to talk to these people and try to figure them out, because I don't know, every once in a while somebody comes back from a dark side, like Ken White, the law blogger, used to be a prosecutor and is now sort of a good limited libertarian. I'm trying to think of other examples. I'm painfully optimistic in terms of like soldiers. I mean, a lot of soldiers who became vehemently anti-war after seeing it for themselves. There's hope that people will get it, and there's good in actually asking and trying to draw out somebody awful. But it's like you get screaming in a corner, of the internet that no one visits, or you get deferring and politeness and these things that are just vile. And that there's got to be a middle to that, but people seem unable to find it, which drives me nuts.
No, I believe in redemption, and I welcome it. I hope people see errors, and you're right. There are people who have done that. I mean, look at David Stockman. Well, Stockman always had some good instincts. He was Reagan's OMB guy,
Mm-hmm.
budget guy, and he's super now. I mean, he's a complete anti-interventionist. His blog is really good. He's reposted libertarian stuff. I've been there on his site a couple of times, reposting stuff from my blog. So, he's not somebody who was, fully on the dark side, but he was in an administration that,
Sure.
did some intervening, and actually didn't even leave government smaller, despite what conservatives might think.
Right.
Wouldn't even get rid of draft registration. If we're going to talk about Reagan, not to open that up, but he didn't even do something he could have done by simply the stroke of a pen, right? It was an executive order by Jimmy Carter, and he could have undone that on day one, and didn't. I'm not sure what Stockman was saying behind the scenes, but he might have been good on that issue. But no, I think we should welcome people who realize they've been, supporting or actually part of a bad government operation. If I'm not repeating myself.
Yes, redundancy, quite. Yeah, I mean, I think some of the more overtly radical anarchist stuff does come into play there, where I think that you do need to stop. Maybe you do need to I don't know if I should, not even address Ron Paul or Justin Amash as congressmen. I mean, I don't know what we should be doing to sort of, suggest that these people are not, that, they're not elevated above us and such. But maybe we should save that for the really awful people. I have failed to applaud for W and Obama in real life, so I feel like I'm doing okay. But we're gonna need, and I booed John Bolton, so I feel like I'm doing God's work.
He deserves booing, certainly. Is he going to throw his hat in the ring, and doesn't he talk about possibly running for president?
I think, thankfully, he's going to leave that particular type of horror to Lindsey Graham. You know, so warmongery that a lot of sort of middling people are like, all right, buddy, maybe we don't need to bomb everywhere.
Well, he wants to bomb, Iran. Was he in, I think, the Washington Post he's called for, or was it the New York Times he called for? What are we waiting for, basically, was the theme of his article. Why haven't we bombed them by now?
See, I want to get inside the heads of people like that without... If I just yell at them, it's not going to do anything. They deserve it. My God, they deserve more than that. But,
right.
I would love to sit down and be like, why? Tell me. Just tell me why. And I don't know. But, like, when you see, Cheney or someone interviewed, there's this hideous confidence that everything that was done had to be done and was the right decision. And I think Cheney sleeps very well at night,
Well, I hope not. I know that with the one bit of justice we get is that Bush and Cheney and maybe Rumsfeld and some of the others, Condoleezza Rice, can't travel abroad with confidence. I think there's some reluctance for them to go to Europe because they remember what happened to Pinochet, right? He got arrested abroad because there's this extended jurisdiction idea for people who commit war crimes and who have fought and launched aggressive wars. So they have to be hesitant, and some of those people have canceled trips that they had planned. And while no one ever said why, the suspicion was that they were concerned because maybe a prosecutor said something in one of the European countries about, we'll have to look at this, and that has been enough. So it's a small thing, I realize. You and I aren't going to be popping champagne over this, but travel to them, to Europe and other places they probably rank that pretty high. They think they're important, very important people, and gosh, they should be able to travel the world. So if they're at all hesitant and actually don't do it, it's something. We grab onto what we can. It's not nothing. It may be less than we want, but it's greater than zero.
Yeah, restricting their free reign is good. A little bit, it makes me think, their caviar supplies have run low. It is a true tragedy. But, no, if they really don't feel comfortable traveling, good. I mean, I'm pleased to hear that. I hadn't heard that before.
Well, we ought to be talking about that and hopefully some of our friends who are getting more prominent places, like maybe Steve Chapman and Jacob Sullivan, like you said, should be writing about this because maybe they ought to direct it to Obama and say, listen, President Obama, you have, a year and a half to go? You're going to want to travel the world. You're helping Saudi Arabia starve Yemenis because there's a starvation blockade, right? They import most of their food. There's a blockade by Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf countries, but assisted by the U.S. They're assisting the carpet bombing that's killing people. Do you want to be able to travel when you leave office? Don't you want to take your wife on a nice, whirlwind, global trip? So maybe you need to start thinking about this and making amends. It's not too late. Yeah. So, that would be a great idea. Maybe I'll have to write that myself, but I don't get to kind of the places that the people I just mentioned do. They have bigger megaphones than I have.
Well, still, that's a good. I mean, I didn't realize that was ever a concern to some of these awful people. So that is good to know.
There's precedent. It's been discussed. This doctrine, which I think is called global jurisdiction or extended jurisdiction. I mean, not everybody regards it as legitimate because, why should Spain, say, be able to arrest Cheney? But there is international law for such things. And I assume it goes back to Nuremberg, right? The Nuremberg trials, which was trials after World War II, put on by the victors.
Right.
Not by the not by a new German administration, but by the winners. And they convicted people and executed people for prosecuting wars of aggression and crimes against humanity. So there is precedent.
Right. I mean, who's Spain to arrest Dick Cheney? We should all be permitted to make a citizen's arrest of Dick Cheney. Who is Dick Cheney to destroy entire countries? I mean, my God.
That's exactly right. So maybe we need to, get a drumbeat going here and have people talking about this and writing about it. and maybe it'll get to Obama. Who knows? And he could think, you know what? I never thought of that. I won't be able to travel confident that I won't get arrested in some, civilized country.
Yeah.
like
Spain.
Yeah, or England or someplace.
Yeah, I will look into this more myself because I really didn't know.
Look up the Pinochet case.
Oh, I will. Yeah. I don't know.
At the end here, is there any plugging you have to do of the next? Is there a next webinar?
I wasn't told what's coming up next. So I can't smoothly.
Something great must be coming up.
Something always fantastic. Let me remind the people of your blog and such. I have no.
My blog is Free Association, and you can get there by sheldonrichman.com. Very easy. But my stuff is reposted twice a week at reason.com, so you can catch it there, or look for me on Facebook because the links always get there. I've been hitting counterpunch lately in any war when it's foreign policy, so it's easy to find me.
Yes, and people should. I don't see anything like flashy. It must. So Liberty.me can do its own thing.
Okay.
People can read me at Anti-War. I have to write something for tomorrow so that I don't...
Read her column.
Yeah, Liberty.me says there's nothing exciting happening. All right, this was good. I think we're done.
If you don't want any excitement in your life, stay tuned for the next thing.
Well, I wouldn't say that, but...
Maybe 2 weeks from now, I won't promise this, but maybe 2 weeks from now we can talk about the Charleston, South Carolina case. I have an op-ed today, which maybe I guess will be on Reason tomorrow. It's on my blog today. Some people want to look at it, where I use a book. I start off with the point that lots of people, of course, are using the shooting in Charleston to promote gun control, right? A new round of gun control, which they've been unable to get.
Mm-hmm.
I want to show the irony of that by quoting a fairly new book by Charles Cobb called "That Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed: How Guns Made the Civil Rights Movement Possible." Very interesting book by a journalist and in his youth a civil rights activist with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee back in the 60s. So he's a veteran of that. Please look at the article, and if anybody's still out there, come prepared to discuss or bring questions. That'd be a good subject next week, unless something really big happens,
right.
like the same-sex marriage decision, which could happen, and we decide to do that instead.
Or we can have two topics. We can do whatever we want. I should read that book, though. That sounds It's a
fascinating book. Yeah, really good. Good piece of history.
Yeah.
Charles Cobb. It's in Kindle. You can find it in Kindle format. Okay. Thanks, Lucy.
All right. Thank you, Sheldon. Good to rant with you as always.
See you 2 weeks from tonight.
Sounds good. Bye.
Bye. Countries, more or less regular war in Iraq and Syria, without any congressional authorization, he seems more at liberty to do what he wants and do bad stuff than King John was when the barons forced Magna Carta on him. At least, even though King John ignored Magna Carta pretty much and it was nullified by the Pope and all that, we won't go into those details again. At least he probably at night didn't sleep that well, knowing there were rebellious barons who would withhold money and give him grief. What keeps up Barack Obama at night? Does he think there's going to be a tax strike? Does he even think there's going to be people in the streets protesting? No, he doesn't have to worry about any of that. So that was the hook for this piece to discuss all the stuff that Obama is doing without any kind of authorization. He doesn't believe he needs it, and this should be intolerable to people.
And it isn't. There's kind of a million avenues we could take from just this, even just the headline, but also in the body of the piece you kind of talk about basically war powers, and I don't know if you want to go, be specific.
Last time.
Hi everybody. If there isn't everybody, welcome to Liberty.me Live. I'm Lucy Steigerwald. I'm here with the Sheldon Richman. He deserves a the. After much technical difficulties, we both appear to be here, and that's good. And you know Sheldon Richman from Center for a Stateless Society and the Freeman in the past and the Freedom Daily, and weekly he's on Reason, and his blog is Free Association, and so is this little podcast we've got going. And what are we talking about today, Sheldon? I should say let's get down to business.
We are talking about an op-ed that I wrote called King John Would Envy Barack Obama, President Obama. And
well,
so
and
go ahead.
Why? Just why? Explain yourself.
I guess I could be accused of some slight exaggeration, and that may be. But I was trying to. I was doing another column in observing the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta. If people were here 2 weeks ago, they'd remember we actually talked about that. And so it occurred to me that with Obama conducting drone wars in I don't know how many
this evening about that as well, and I mean, I don't know. Again, there are a billion angles. Like as anarchists, we don't think a constitutionally solid war is necessarily a good one, but they're just sort of practical roadblocks to make Congress actually vote on it. If the president just says, "I'll go to war," but it doesn't count as war, and you won't bother to vote on it.
Right.
I'm trying to think of a way, just what to ask about this. I mean, I get so cynical about this. Did anyone ever, obey the War Powers Act before or since '73? I mean,
no president has wanted to invoke it since it was passed because they didn't want to acknowledge that there was that limit on the president's ability to make war. So. And Obama went to war in Libya. He bombed Libya in an effort to change the regime, which happened in 2011. And he said, well, these aren't really hostilities, so the War Powers Act is not relevant. And some people laughed at that, but not enough people laughed at it. He should have been laughed out of town.
Right.
And yet he said that with a straight face, that this didn't qualify. And there were members of Congress who agree with him. Now, there were some that don't. Rand Paul and others. Rand Paul, I don't think, was in the Senate in those days, but there were people who said you should at least have to come and get a declaration, or you need to at least invoke the War Powers Act, which lets the president. I mean, this is all real bogus when you think about it. It lets the president, without authorization, place troops in a combat situation in hostilities. But that is only supposed to be when there's some threat to the United States, which there wasn't obviously in Libya. So number one, he should have been able to do that. But even if he did it, he's supposed to get authorization within 30 days, and if he doesn't get authorization from Congress, he's supposed to withdraw them, I think, in 60 days. And then there's some 90-day deadline too. There's a whole bunch of deadlines. Well, all that was just ignored, and not enough, people in Congress with any clout were pushing it. They just let him get away with it. Now he's doing similar things in Syria and Iraq with respect to the Islamic State. And he did ask for an authorization, but he said, "I don't need it. I'll ask for it just to have, cheerleaders." But then what he asked was so vague and broad that people who identify the Democrats were saying this is just this is a precedent for unlimited global war. So it's ridiculous. So some Democrats in Congress were very reluctant to go with it because it was so broad. But and the funny thing is, Republicans didn't want to go with it. They thought it wasn't specific. It didn't have there wasn't enough of a plan behind it. So it got nowhere. But that didn't stop Obama from prosecuting these wars. And then he's also supporting Saudi Arabia's war, carpet bombing in Yemen. Although we've been, of course, the U.S. has been bombing with drones, has been hitting Yemenis with Hellfire missiles for a long time anyway. That goes back to the Bush days. So it's a mess. So he has less to worry about than King John did, it seems to me. He can do whatever he wants.
Well, I mean, the Iraqi and Afghanistan authorizations for use of military force, those are the technicalities. You always need, some stretching of language or some excuse. And, well, he's not, I mean, I quite easily believe that in his own mind, when he sleeps at night, he does not think that he is stretching you know, like the laws and the authorizations to the point of absurdity, because conveniently enough, some terrorist maybe, you know, met another terrorist who shared a terrorist meeting with